7 German fighters appear above him, sliding out of the sun in a tight, disciplined formation. His fuel gauge is already in the red. His radio is dead. Below him, a wounded American bomber limps west, trailing smoke over occupied France. Captain Robert Johnson does not turn. He does not dive. He does not signal panic. He holds altitude and waits. The lead Messerschmitt edges forward, nose dipping just slightly, testing the moment. Still, Johnson waits. What the German pilots cannot see, what they will never understand until it is too late, is that this American has been counting seconds since they first appeared. Measuring distance. Calculating closure rates. Estimating fuel burn. In his mind, the fight is already unfolding, step by step, like a solved equation. Spring, 1944. The air war over Western Europe has become a brutal exercise in arithmetic. Every morning, long streams of American bombers carve white contrails across the sky, slicing through occupied France and Belgium on their way toward the factories and oil plants of the Rhine. Beneath them, fields and forests are littered with wreckage, aluminum shards, burned engines, parachutes that never opened. The 8th Air Force is losing men faster than training commands can replace them. For every industrial target destroyed, dozens of aircrew vanish into fire, captivity, or the cold ground below. The bomber offensive continues anyway. It has to. There is no other way to break Germany's war machine. Fighter escorts push deeper into enemy airspace with every mission. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang has changed the war in the air, giving American pilots the range to escort bombers all the way to their targets and back. But range brings new dangers. Fuel management becomes a matter of life and death. A navigation error of just a few minutes can be fatal. And every mile deeper into Germany sharpens the Luftwaffe's response. German fighter tactics evolve quickly. They no longer waste strength on mass attacks against tight bomber formations. Instead, they wait. They observe escort patterns. They let the bombers pass, then hunt the stragglers, the damaged aircraft, the isolated fighters, the men who drift just far enough from discipline to be vulnerable. It is efficient. It is ruthless. And it works. At RAF Debden in Essex, the 4th Fighter Group operates from a former Royal Air Force station that still smells of damp concrete and aviation fuel. Ground crews work through the night, patching bullet holes, replacing coolant lines, and swapping out engines pushed past their limits. Intelligence officers track loss rates that climb week after week. Pilots write letters home they hope will never be sent. Each morning begins the same way. Merlin engines roar to life. Pre-flight checks are conducted by habit and by fear, oxygen systems tested, gun harmonization confirmed, fuel calculations reviewed again and again. Every pilot knows the statistics. 1 in 4 will not finish a combat tour. 1 in 10 will not return from today's mission. Among them is a man who does not stand out at first glance. Captain Robert Johnson speaks little during briefings. He does not dominate conversations in the officers' mess. He listens. He watches. When others speculate, he calculates. And when he flies, there is something in his timing, something precise and unsettling, that separates him even from the best pilots around him. The ground crews know him as the man who brought his fighter home so badly damaged that the wreckage was later used in training films. The armorers know him as the pilot who counts his ammunition before and after every sortie, tracking rounds fired like a bookkeeper balancing accounts. Intelligence officers know him as the pilot whose combat reports read like engineering summaries, sparse, exact, unemotional. Johnson does not fit the popular image of a fighter ace. He does not chase glory. He does not tell exaggerated stories. When other pilots gather to relive dogfights in loud detail, Johnson sits alone with his gun camera footage, advancing it frame by frame. Deflection angles. Closure rates. Burst length. Ammunition expenditure. What others call instinct, he calls math. What others call luck, he calls preparation. If this kind of story matters, stories of quiet brilliance rather than loud heroics, then this is one worth remembering. Robert Samuel Johnson was born in Lawton, Oklahoma, in 1920. It was a place of dust, open sky, and mechanical common sense, where broken machines were repaired, not replaced. His father ran a small garage. Johnson grew up with grease under his fingernails and the logic of engines in his head. Machines made sense to him. Carburetors, timing chains, valve clearances, everything followed rules. If something failed, there was a reason. If something broke, it could be understood. Fixed. Improved. He was not a natural athlete. He was not especially social. He read technical manuals for recreation. When Johnson looked at an airplane, he did not see romance or freedom. He saw a system, an assembly of components that either worked together in harmony or killed you without warning. In 1941, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps. Not out of reckless patriotism, though he felt that too. He joined because flying intrigued him the way engines did. It was a puzzle of physics, fuel, and geometry, and he wanted to solve it. Flight training revealed something instructors rarely encountered. Johnson was not the smoothest pilot. He was not the fastest learner. But his precision was unsettling. He flew by numbers. He calculated fuel consumption in his head. He could estimate altitude loss in a turn within a few dozen feet. Where other cadets relied on feel, Johnson relied on measurement. One instructor wrote in his evaluation that Johnson flew like an engineer pretending to be a pilot. It was not meant as praise. But it was accurate. By the time he reached combat status and shipped to England in early 1943, Johnson had already developed habits that set him apart. He did not drink heavily. He did not chase excitement on leave. He studied after-action reports. He interviewed returning pilots about German tactics. He sketched engagement geometries in a notebook he carried everywhere. Other pilots thought him odd. Some thought him cold. None thought him careless. His first victories came in the summer of 1943. Clean engagements. Short bursts. No wasted ammunition. He maneuvered into position, fired only when the geometry was perfect, confirmed the result, and returned to escort duty without comment. By the end of the year, his tally had grown. More importantly, so had his understanding of the enemy. He learned to recognize Luftwaffe units by silhouette alone. He memorized the performance envelopes of the Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, their climb rates, turning radii, fuel limits. He studied them not to admire them, but to defeat them. And he learned something else. Something most pilots never did. He learned the power of appearing vulnerable. Of letting the enemy believe they held the advantage. Of waiting. That patience would be tested in April 1944, on a mission that should have ended his life. And high above France, with 7 enemy fighters closing in and his fuel nearly gone, Robert Johnson prepared to prove that in air combat, the man who waits is often the man who survives. The mission briefing that morning was routine, which was often the most dangerous kind. Escort heavy bombers to a synthetic oil plant outside Leipzig. Provide top cover during the penetration. Defend against interceptors during the bomb run. Shepherd the damaged aircraft back toward the channel. No surprises expected. No deviations planned. Robert Johnson had heard it all before. Dawn broke cold and pale over eastern England as P-51 Mustangs rolled down the runway at RAF Debden, each carrying full internal fuel and underwing drop tanks. Merlin engines screamed as they clawed for altitude, climbing through broken cloud toward the assembly point over the coast. Below them, the North Sea lay flat and grey, hammered metal stretching to the horizon. Ahead waited Europe, and somewhere beyond it, German radar stations were already plotting their course. Johnson's flight took position 3,000 feet above the bomber stream. B-17s and B-24s droned eastward in long, disciplined boxes, their contrails stitching the sky into a white grid. It was beautiful in a distant, lethal way. And it was fragile. An hour into enemy airspace, the first attack came. Bandits, high sun. Focke-Wulf 190s dropped out of the glare, diving hard toward the bombers in a classic slashing attack. Johnson rolled his element into position without hesitation. Tracers reached upward. One German fighter took hits and peeled away trailing smoke. Another broke off and disappeared toward the deck. Johnson did not pursue. Chasing kills was how pilots ran out of fuel and died alone. His job was the bombers. He reset his position, scanning the sky in slow, deliberate sweeps. Seconds later, another call crackled over the radio. Multiple Messerschmitts, climbing from low 6. Bf 109 surged upward, angling for the rear of the bomber formation where defensive fire was weakest. Johnson reacted instantly, leading his flight into a shallow dive that forced the Germans to scatter before they could settle into firing position. No kills. No losses. But the damage was already done. Combat maneuvering burned fuel at an unforgiving rate. Johnson checked his gauges. Enough to make it home, but only if nothing else went wrong. He made a mental note and adjusted his plan accordingly. The bomb run began. Flak bursts bloomed around the bombers like black flowers, ripping holes in the sky. 2 B-17s fell out of formation, spiraling downward in smoke and flame. Another staggered onward with one engine feathered, altitude slowly bleeding away. Johnson's flight slid into position above the wounded bomber. Then things began to unravel. First, his wingman's radio went silent. No static. No response. Moments later, Johnson's own radio died as well, either battle damage or a system failure in the relay aircraft. Either way, coordination was now limited to hand signals and instinct. Fuel continued to tick down. The crippled bomber fell farther behind the main formation, every mile increasing its isolation. Johnson stayed with it, weaving above and behind, scanning constantly. He knew exactly what would happen next. And he was right. 30 miles from the French border, 7 German fighters appeared from the north. They did not attack. They did not dive or climb. They simply matched altitude and speed, pacing the Americans like predators alongside wounded prey. Johnson saw them immediately. 7 Bf 109s in a loose gaggle. Veteran pilots. Disciplined. Patient. His heart rate did not spike. His grip on the control stick did not tighten. He took in the geometry at a glance, relative position, sun angle, closure rate, and began calculating. 7 enemy fighters. 1 damaged bomber. 3 effective Mustangs. Critical fuel. No radio. The Germans held position, studying them. They were waiting for panic. Waiting for a mistake. Waiting for someone to break formation. Johnson rocked his wings sharply to get his wingman's attention and pointed toward the enemy. Then he tapped his helmet. Think. The second stretched. The bomber lumbered westward, engine straining. The Messerschmitts drifted closer, still not committing. They were reading the Americans now, judging fuel state, discipline, morale. One of Johnson's pilots began to edge forward, instinct pulling him toward the threat. Johnson chopped his hand downward in a hard signal. Hold. The German formation shifted slightly. 2 fighters slid outward, beginning to form a loose bracket. Still no attack. They were confident. Confident enough to take their time. That was when Johnson saw the detail that changed everything. The lead Messerschmitt edged forward just a fraction. Not an attack, just a test. A probe to see how the Americans would react. Johnson did nothing. Another few seconds passed. The lead German edged forward again, nose dipping ever so slightly. This time, 2 of the fighters on the flanks began to widen their spacing, preparing to roll in once the leader committed. Johnson's wingman glanced over, confusion visible even through the oxygen mask. Why aren't we fighting? Because this was the fight. Johnson wasn't waiting out of fear. He was waiting because the Germans were following a pattern. A predictable one. He had seen it before. Studied it. Logged it. Once the leader committed, the others would follow. And once they followed, their cohesion would depend on that leader's survival. The German pilot made his decision. The lead Messerschmitt nosed down 5 degrees. That was the moment. Johnson rolled inverted and pulled. The Mustang dropped like a stone, airspeed climbing fast, 400 knots, then more. He did not aim for the nearest enemy. He did not aim for the most threatening one. He aimed for the leader. The Germans reacted instantly, braking hard left, but they were already too late. Johnson had not reacted to their move, he had anticipated it. He fired a 2-second burst. .50 caliber rounds tore through the Messerschmitt's fuselage. The canopy shattered. Metal fragments spun away in the slipstream. The fighter snapped into a violent spin and fell out of the sky. Johnson did not look back. He was already reversing, climbing back into the fight as the remaining Germans scrambled to recover from the shock. The formation had collapsed. And now, the hunters were no longer sure who was hunting whom. The sky exploded into motion. The 2 Messerschmitts that had been preparing to bracket the Americans broke hard in opposite directions, clawing for altitude and separation. Another rolled downward, trying to convert speed into distance. The remaining fighters hesitated, just long enough to matter. Johnson climbed through their confusion. He did not chase the damaged aircraft falling behind him. He did not waste altitude or fuel on a victory already decided. Instead, he positioned himself where he could be seen. Where he could become a problem. The German pilots noticed immediately. 2 of them turned toward him, trying to regain the initiative. Johnson watched their approach angles, their relative energy states, the subtle way their turns tightened sooner than they should have. They were already running calculations of their own, and coming up short. They had flown out to intercept. They had maneuvered repeatedly. Their fuel margins were thinner than they wanted. Johnson proved it by diving again, dragging the fight lower. The 2 Germans followed at first, then hesitated. Their noses lifted. They leveled off. They were not going to chase him to the deck. They chose survival. Above them, the rest of the fight unraveled. Johnson's wingmen engaged the remaining Messerschmitts in tight, violent turns. Tracers streaked past canopies. 1 German fighter took hits and rolled away trailing smoke. Another tried to loop onto an American's tail, and suddenly found Johnson climbing back into the fight from below. Johnson did not have a firing solution. He did not need one. The German pilot saw him coming and broke off instantly, abandoning the attack and diving away to escape. Momentum shifted again. What had been a coordinated ambush was now a scattered disengagement. 7 had become 4. 4 had become 3. And the 3 that remained were no longer hunting. They were calculating their own odds. Johnson climbed back to escort altitude and checked his fuel gauge. The needle was buried in red. Minutes left. Maybe 10. Maybe less. The damaged bomber was still flying, slower now, but holding together. Johnson slid back into position above it, scanning constantly. His wingman pulled alongside and flashed a quick hand signal. Still alive. One of the remaining Messerschmitts made a half-hearted pass at the bomber, firing from too far out to be effective. Johnson turned into him immediately, forcing the German to choose between pressing the attack or defending himself. The German chose to live. He pulled up and away, engine straining, and disappeared eastward. The other 2 were already gone, breaking contact entirely. The sky went suddenly, unnervingly quiet. Johnson held position for another long moment, expecting a final trick, a last desperate dive. Nothing came. The Luftwaffe pilots had decided the math no longer favored them. Johnson reformed his flight and signaled west. Now came the most dangerous part of the mission. Getting home. They crossed into friendly airspace 10 minutes later, the French coast sliding beneath them like a promise kept. Johnson scanned the horizon and spotted an emergency landing strip near the coast, pierced steel planking laid out on a narrow stretch of land for moments like this. He entered the pattern carefully, every movement precise, conserving the last fumes in his tanks. Gear down. Flaps down. Airspeed steady. The Mustang settled onto the strip with barely enough fuel left to taxi clear. The engine coughed once as he rolled to a stop, then died completely. Johnson sat for a moment, hands steady on the controls, breathing calm and measured. Then he climbed out and walked toward the operations tent to file his report. The duty officer looked up, surprised to see him. "How many did you claim?" Johnson thought for a moment. "One confirmed. Possibly two. Gun camera will decide." The officer raised an eyebrow. 7 enemy fighters. Fuel emergency. No radio. How did you handle it? Johnson shrugged slightly. "I waited until they made a mistake." "What mistake?" Johnson met his eyes. "They assumed patience was weakness. They assumed silence was fear." The gun camera footage told the rest of the story. 2 confirmed kills. 1 probable. More importantly, no losses. Intelligence officers studied the engagement for hours. The geometry was unusual. Johnson had not turned into the first threat. He had not gone after the nearest target. He had waited, deliberately, until the enemy leader committed fully to the attack. One analyst noted that Johnson's dive had not been evasive. It had been predatory. A calculated intercept based on predicted movement, not reaction. They asked Johnson to explain his thinking. He told them what he had learned through months of observation. German fighter units followed patterns. Once the leader committed, the rest followed. If the leader was destroyed at the moment of commitment, the formation lost cohesion. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't luck. It was discipline. Within weeks, Johnson's method began appearing in briefings across the group. Do not react immediately. Observe. Let the enemy commit. Then strike the decision maker. Johnson's victory count continued to rise, but that was never the part that mattered most. What mattered was the effect. Bomber losses dropped. Pilots flying under his escort survived at higher rates than average. He had not flown harder. He had flown smarter. And in the brutal arithmetic of the air war over Europe, that made all the difference. Robert Johnson's victory tally continued to grow through the spring and summer of 1944, but the numbers never interested him the way they interested others. By the end of his tour, he would be credited with 27 confirmed aerial victories, placing him among the top American aces in the European theater. His name appeared on lists. His photograph circulated quietly through command channels. Medals followed. But Johnson rarely spoke about any of it. What mattered to him was something harder to quantify. Fewer bombers were being lost. More crews were making it home. Pilots flying under his escort survived engagements that, earlier in the war, would have been fatal. The statistics reflected it clearly. Analysts studying Johnson's combat reports noticed patterns that set him apart. His average ammunition expenditure per kill was significantly lower than that of other aces. His fuel management was consistently within textbook margins, even under pressure. Most striking of all, the loss rate among pilots flying in formations he led was measurably lower than average. Johnson had not relied on aggression alone. He had relied on timing. Within the 4th Fighter Group, his methods became doctrine. Younger pilots who initially mistook his quiet for hesitation learned otherwise the hard way, by watching German fighters break apart the moment Johnson moved. He taught them that the first instinct in combat was often the wrong one. Everyone wants to act, he told them. Very few people want to wait. As the Allied invasion of Europe approached, the air war intensified. Missions grew longer. Resistance grew fiercer. And still, Johnson flew with the same methodical precision that had defined him from the beginning. He did not chase glory. He did not hunt kills for reputation. He hunted outcomes. And the outcome he cared about was survival. When Johnson's combat tour ended in late 1944, he returned home quietly. There were no parades. No speeches. No memoir waiting to be written. He went back to Oklahoma and resumed a life that looked unremarkable from the outside. He worked as a flight instructor for a time, teaching young pilots the fundamentals that had kept him alive. Later, he moved into aviation management. He rarely spoke about the war unless asked directly, and even then, his answers were short, factual, and unsentimental. Those who knew him noticed something consistent. He never embellished. He never dramatized. He never turned fear into mythology. He described air combat the same way he described engines or systems. Inputs. Outputs. Consequences. Years later, historians revisiting 8th Air Force combat records began to see what had been overlooked at the time. Johnson was not simply a high-scoring ace. He was a thinker in a profession that often rewarded impulse. A mathematician operating in a sky full of chaos. His legacy was not the enemy aircraft he destroyed. It was the men he brought home. As air combat evolved, technology transformed everything around it. Propellers gave way to jets. Guns were replaced by missiles. Radar replaced eyesight. The battlefield stretched beyond the horizon and into electronic space. But one principle never changed. Patience remained a weapon. The ability to observe instead of react. To wait while others rushed. To let an enemy believe they held the advantage until the moment they no longer did. Those skills survived every technological leap because they were human, not mechanical. Robert Johnson understood that long before most. He lived into his 80s, attending reunions and occasionally speaking with historians. He remained precise and methodical to the end, unchanged by the fame he never sought. When he died in 1998, his obituaries listed his medals, his victories, his rank. They missed the deeper truth. Johnson had not just been an ace. He had been proof that war was not won by speed alone, or courage alone, or firepower alone. It was won by clarity, by the ability to think when everything around you demanded panic. High above France, with 7 enemy fighters closing in, no fuel to spare, and no radio to call for help, Robert Johnson did not survive because he was braver than the men who died around him. He survived because he waited. He turned silence into a weapon. He turned patience into a trap. And when the enemy finally struck, they discovered, too late, that the trap had been theirs all along. In the end, the most dangerous man in the sky was not the loudest or the fastest. It was the one who understood that every second of restraint was a second someone else got to live. Robert Johnson knew that. And on one April morning in 1944, he proved it.